Good morning, Thomas. I'm just going to read a quick introduction, but I'm very excited to introduce Thomas Phillip, who is the Faculty Director of Teacher Education at UC Berkeley. Dr. Phillip studies how ideology shapes learning and how learning is a site of ideological contestation and becoming. As a learning scientist and teacher educator, he's interested in how teachers make sense of power and hierarchy and act on their sense of agency as they navigate and ultimately transform classrooms and institutions toward more equitable, just, and democratic practices and outcomes. His scholarship explores the possibilities and tensions that emerge with the use of artificial intelligence and digital learning technologies in classrooms. He is a fellow of the American Educational Research Association, and under his leadership, the Berkeley Teacher Education Program was awarded the 2023 Division K Award for Innovations in Research on Equity and Social Justice in Teaching and Teacher Education from AERA. So I'll go ahead and turn things over to you, Thomas. Thank you so much for being here.
Lisa, can you see the screen? And
Yes,
okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be in conversation with all of you. My talk today is entitled Attending to the Moment, Engaging Every Teaching Interaction as Ethical and Political. I wish we were in person. I think it makes a big difference to see all of you. But in the Zoom context, I'm going to just ask all of you for a moment, if you don't mind, to unmute and just say good morning or hello, just so we can hear the voices that are present here today.
Good morning.
Buenos días.
Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning,
Hola,
Thomas.
buenos días.
All right, Thomas.
Good morning, Dr. Phillip.
Buenos días.
Good morning.
Wonderful. Thank you all. It's good to hear your voices and to know that we can make these connections even if we are in this virtual context. So first of all, I am just really honored to be here at a conference that focuses on the centrality of supervision. So a huge thank you to Lisa, Becca, and others in the core team for having created this space. It's, as Lisa was saying, it's incredibly unique to have a focus on supervision. It shouldn't be, but it is. And for us to recognize the importance of this. And for me, it's been a part of my own journey as a teacher educator. And it's a bit of a confession, but I think this is important for us to state in order to understand how supervision is situated within teacher education. So when I started off at UCLA as an assistant professor in 2008, it was very easy to do my research in teacher education and to teach my courses and not understand how the program of teacher education is really integrated or is related to each other. And so there's a tendency for all of us in teacher education to perhaps assume that the work we do is the most important work we do that's done in teacher education without recognizing its relationship to other parts of a program. And it was only a number of years later when I started teaching an integrated course where, and I'll talk about this later, that integrated the social foundations course, the learning theory course, and the field placement, and saw supervision and field placements from a different angle, that I really began appreciating the power of supervision and the field placement. And it shouldn't be like that, but this is part of the politics of teacher education that we need to acknowledge. In my current role as the faculty director of teacher education in Berkeley, I see this even more profoundly in terms of the impact of intentional, deliberate, and thoughtful supervision. So this brings us back to this question of locating supervision in the politics of university-based teacher education. I think it was also highlighted in Lisa's chart or pie graph from earlier on in terms of oftentimes university-based teacher education rely on part-time faculty or part-time instructors, which makes it harder for all of you to develop professionally, to share your goals, share your hopes, share your skills and insights. And it speaks to the power of this community. But it also reminds us that it alters relationships of power in terms of the direction of programs, who has a say in a program, and what the mission and goals of a program are. So it's really important for us to start thinking about locating supervision and the role of supervisors in this larger set of politics. And I'll come back to these points later, but I do want to name them up front, because any change that we make around the professional learning and development of supervisors needs to acknowledge this larger political context in which teacher education happens. So what I'll have argued for and will continue to argue for is a programmatic lens in redesigning teacher education that puts supervision and field work front and center for our students, and in terms of programmatic directions. So the guiding question for today that I want to invite us to think about is what it might mean to attend to each moment of teaching as ethical and political. And two, if we consider each moment of teaching as ethical and political, when we engage with our student teachers, what does it mean for your work as a supervisor? So I'm just going to give us 30 seconds to ground some of our ideas and to think about how you're considering the political and ethical dimensions of each moment of teaching. So we'll come back to this question at the end, and I'd love to hear how all of you are making sense of these possibilities and their limitations as well. So for me, I just want to highlight two elements of what it means for each moment of teaching to be considered ethical and political. The first is to remind ourselves that each interaction in the classroom, and we've all been there, either as teachers or teacher educators, to know that each interaction presents a multitude of possibilities. There are so many directions that any interaction can go in. What we choose to say next, how we hold our body, the attention that we provide to an idea, all of those are split-second decisions that we make that have, again, a multitude of possibilities. So knowing that each of those decisions have their own set of possibilities and consequences, right? Whose ideas does it validate? Does it bring up? How does it support dialogue and collaboration? How do we think about building community? All of those are embedded within these minute interactions. But I also want to stress the idea that any act by a teacher only gains its full meaning after a student has responded. So when we think about interaction, and we'll talk about improvisation in just a moment, but oftentimes we think about our acts as a teacher carrying their full importance on their own. But the nature of human interaction is that whatever we say doesn't gain its full meaning until someone else responds. Only then does it gain meaning in interaction, right? So it's through that joint meaning making. So it's important for us to consider that when we make meaning with our students, when we think about each moment of teaching, it's in relationship, it's in joint construction with our students. So today's focus is thinking about supervision to one, support teacher improvisation, and two, to support this attention to each moment of teaching as ethical and political. So my colleagues and I have written about this in other contexts, but I do want to raise this tension that exists in teacher education. And that is the tension between how people have thought about practice versus improvisation. So there is a tendency in teacher education across the board to think that teaching is more like a scripted play, that we can say something and expect certain types of responses. I mean, perhaps the most reductionist approach to this is, say, Doug Lemov's 63 techniques to be um, a champion, right? But there's other versions of this in terms of core practices and other, the idea that we need to prepare teachers to be ready for any context, right? That they are decontextualized, that you can go ahead, step into a classroom, regardless of the context, your identity, your students' identities, and expect classrooms to play out in a certain way. But another metaphor to think about teaching and learning to teach is that it's fundamentally more improvisational. That the steps that we take are highly dependent on context. It's highly dependent on our own identities, on the identities of our students, the camaraderie or community that exists in classrooms. So there is no one given way of doing something, but it's really about generating together with your students approaches that meet the needs of your students and the classroom community. So there's an emphasis here on improvisation. I would argue that this is a false dichotomy. Practice and improvisation go together. There are things that, as others have argued, some things are more improvisational, some things are less improvisational. But I want us to intentionally think about the role of improvisation. And part of the challenge here is that many would argue in teacher education that student teachers or novice teachers can't learn to improvise until they've learned certain practices, right? You have to learn the basics first, and then you can improvise. And again, I think this is a false dichotomy. And instead, how do we think about the teaching of intentional thinking of improvisation? So one idea I've been thinking about over the year is this notion of principled improvisation. So improvisation can happen in many ways, and sometimes the outcomes of these improvisations aren't towards the goals of equity and justice. So how do we think about improvisation that is purposefully oriented towards justice? And that's the notion of the modifier, principled. So this is a reminder again that teachers are constantly solving unsolvable problems. Reidel and Weber referred to this in a paper from the 1970s in public policy as wicked problems. And when they talk about a wicked problem, it's really that they are essentially unsolvable. So just as an example, we might say we want our student teachers or novice teachers to learn how to facilitate whole group discussions, or we want them to learn how to create welcoming classrooms. It's really important. And it's not a one and done situation, right? You never learn how to facilitate a whole group discussion and then you're done with it. You're always constantly solving in terms of improvisation. So one way of saying this is these problems can't actually be solved. At best, they can be resolved over and over again. So each time, even if we're experienced teachers and teacher educators, and we stand in front of a classroom and we're facilitating a whole group discussion, there are ways in which we're improvising in the moment. We're reading a classroom, we're reading our students, we're making meaning with them, we're picking up on ideas. And so there's this idea that we are actually resolving these more over and over. And how do we prepare our teachers to know that this is a process, a continual process? Another element of this is the consequences or repercussion of each interaction continues downstream. Many of us know those moments when we've said something and we just want to draw those words back into our mouth because we know that there are inadequacies, there are shortcomings in the human dimensions of teaching and learning. But it's also a reminder that for student teachers to see the downward repercussions or possibilities of every interaction. And then it comes with the risk that a teacher might too quickly determine that an interaction is similar to something they've experienced before. And examples of this is we can look at a student being disengaged and make assumptions about those forms of disengagement based on our prior experience. And so we end up naming the problem too quickly and going down a path without necessarily taking fully into account and listening to our students. So this is this notion of principled improvisation is a piece that I've written from 2019. Happy to share more and talk about it, but I do want to dig in and bring this to life. So focusing on the moment to moment is another instance of really thinking about the centrality of supervision. So when oftentimes when I think about the moment to moment, there is a concern, if we talk about the moment to moment, how do we attend to the larger macro contexts? And for that, what I want, what I'd like to stress is this is the importance or one of the key roles of intentional supervision, where when you think about something such as the students that you're calling on, the ways in which the questions that you're posing, again, the ways in which you say move your body around a classroom, the ways in which you think about your own authority as a teacher. All of these micro interactions are framed or shaped by the larger macro context, right? These are gendered, they're racialized, they're classed, there's questions of language, and these operations of power continue. So the role of intentional supervision here is to help a student understand how are these micro interactions actually embedded in larger macro systems of power. But the other piece that we also want to embrace is then how do these micro interactions create the macro context? Right? At the end of the day, I think it's essential that we remind ourselves that systems of power just don't exist out there. They have to be created over and over and over again. So a number of sociologists and anthropologists have reminded us of this, right? That these micro interactions cumulatively build up the macro system. So how do we also understand both the gravity of that, but also the sense of promise that when we think about any micro interaction in our classroom, it is a moment in which we're either reproducing or transforming the larger macro systems. And this is a place for us to also think about supporting the relationship between theory and practice, where when we look at these micro interactions, where we, as Lisa even mentioned earlier, supervisors are incredible translators, like moving across spaces of the field, of the university, of coursework, of practice. And it's a way in which we start to support teachers in their inquiry stance to look at their own practice through a lens of theory. But I do think it's really important for us to also build that capacity in teachers to then generate theory and to build theories that are responsive to their own classrooms. So I'm going to talk through two examples, and it's thinking about this idea of how to support principled improvisation. It's very similar to probably what many of you have been doing in your contexts. So it's not to argue that it's unique, it's distinct, but I do want to really focus on the emphasis or the attention to the moment to moment and to the micro. So in this process, it's really about having student teachers being able to narrate their experience. Until we name an interaction, it's hard to then represent it and then to have a conversation about it. So the more we develop the ability to narrate an interaction, the stronger our ability to then analyze it and to reimagine it. And even the narration, as other people have argued, is oftentimes starts off at a very descriptive level, often about what one does as a teacher, as opposed to thinking about how students are experiencing it. The other, from there, what we want to move our students to is the ability to re-narrate an interaction. And when we think about re-narration, it's really thinking about what might that have looked like from the perspectives of others, especially the perspective of other students. Right? And we take this idea of listening to students as something that comes naturally. Yet listening, and especially listening to students, is an art form that takes time to learn. And I think especially for novice teachers, it's incredibly challenging. So part of this process of re-narrating is being able to authentically listen to students So to understand that experience or to understand that interaction from their experience, from their perspective. And from here, it's important for us to re-envision these possibilities. Right? When we look back at an interaction, after we have narrated it, after we've understand the possible re-narrations, this is our opportunity to re-envision a possibility. What might have it look like? So going back to that idea that there are a multitude of possibilities that we could have chosen. There were many paths we could have taken. What might it have it looked like if we took a different path? And what might it look like if we were able to then jointly construct meaning with students? And this is another place where theory and the role of educational theory comes in to help us re-envision possibilities. Because this is a way of seeing things that don't yet exist, but could exist. And finally, we go from re-envisioning to re-engaging with the practice and being able to narrate it again. And this is a moment where theory building comes in. And I think it's really important for all of us in these university-based teacher education contexts to remind ourselves that teaching is not just a technical set of skills. It also includes our teachers being organic intellectuals. It means our teachers being parts of communities and being leaders in that space. And part of that is being able to build theory that is contextually responsive. So what I want to do is I want to provide two examples to bring this context to life and for us to reflect on. So the first case is a case of criticality and the art of listening. And again, this is from a course that I had designed that was from that integrated social foundations, learning theory, and field placement. So the case that we're going to be looking at is from a teacher that we'll call Rosa. First, she was in our teacher education program, and she actually came in with a really wonderful background in YPAR, or Youth Participatory Action Research. So she had a lot of ideas on how to motivate students, how to get them engaged in big ideas, in political ideas. And while this was powerful in many ways, as some of you might imagine, it was also limiting in others, because there are assumptions of how things work in YPAR contexts that don't necessarily translate well to teaching contexts or to classroom contexts. And so with Rosa in particular, she was working on a small group project with her students, and she really wanted them to take on the question of police violence and police brutality. Again, it's a pressing issue in the community. It was a pressing issue within the school context, but it was really coming from her urge to create a curriculum and set of interests around this without necessarily listening to our students. So I'm going to read us an excerpt from this to help us understand the process by which she began to learn to listen. And I want us to attend to that in particular. How do we learn to listen to our students? And what does it mean to think about each moment of teaching as ethical and political? So by week 2, as evidence in her weekly journal, Rosa deliberately experimented with withholding judgment when students said things that were counter to her political commitments. But Rosa struggled to understand why Winston, a student in her class, continued to deny the existence of police brutality. Her experimentation with seating questions was often short-lived, and she continued to focus on convincing Winston about what he experienced as a young man of color, at least from her perspective. A strong sense of withholding judgment and seating questions appeared in week 5 when she reflected on the week's reading. I kept telling myself that I need to ask them questions. Even if they do not share similar backgrounds to me or people I know, they might have experienced it differently and have derived a different understanding of their experiences. Rosa's increased attention to leveraging her own experience to relate to students was another notable shift in week 5. She wrote about how Ephraim, one of the students in her group, had really opened up about his home life and the type of work done by his family. Ephraim's willingness to tell Rosa more about himself provided Rosa the opportunity to share what her parents do for a living and why it's important, quote unquote, that we do well academically. Rosa's use of we indicated her attempt to forge a collective identity with Efrain based on shared experiences in working class families of color, rather than assuming it. From this interaction in particular, Rosa learned the importance of humanizing herself and her students in communicating her expectations. 2 weeks later, when Rosa brought up police violence yet again, Winston put his head down and began shaking his head. For the first time, she explained to him why she was so invested in addressing questions of police brutality. She shared a picture of her 4-year-old son and the story of when he told her that he was cold in a park in San Francisco. She instinctively suggested he wear his hoodie, only to look across the street and watch a police officer interrogate a young man of color in a hoodie. She asked herself at that moment, when should I tell my son to suck it up and be cold? When will he be criminalized for being cold? Rosa reflected on how Winston started asking questions about her son at that point and began to engage the issue of police violence in ways that he hadn't before. Rosa's shift toward listening to students and building on their insights was most evident in week 9, when they visited the California African American Museum as a part of their field inquiry. An exhibit included a picture of a shooting target covered with bullet holes and roses. Unlike what might have been more typical of Rosa's response at the beginning of the quarter, she asked her students what they thought about the reappropriation of the shooting target. Her question created the context for students to take up the specialized language, such as reappropriation that Rosa often used, but also created the space for them to make their own connections between other artists and the symbolism of flowers, such as a relationship to, quote, a funeral, a street from someone who has been shot and families leave candles and flowers, and just the general contrast between flowers and bullets. The lens of principled improvisation prompted Rosa and others who saw themselves as critically conscious to become aware of when they were telling students about the oppression the students were presumably experiencing. The novice teacher's practice, guided by principled improvisation, helped them see the importance of forging shared identities with students rather than assuming them. It opened space for our students to consider how the act of listening was effortful. It moved us from the enthusiastic but cursory recognition at the beginning of the quarter that listening is essential for effective teaching to beginning to theorize a pedagogy of listening and its centrality in the craft of co-constructing meaning with students. So I want us to take a moment here and think about that journey. Parts that I left out is like even in icebreaker activities, when I think there was week 1, a student basically asked Rosa, so what's your race? What's your ethnicity? She ended up in this long explanation of the Treaty of Guadalupe and thinking about settler colonialism, forms of imperialism, et cetera, all which are important, but she recognized how soon the students just tuned out, right? So there was a sense of telling as opposed to listening, telling versus being responsive. And so through this 10-week journey, it's this process of Rosa learning how to listen, still having many of the same political commitments, but also learning to listen. But it was scaffolded by this process of needing to closely attend to interactions, right? Because part of the process was asking students to create as close as possible verbatim transcripts of interactions. So there was a way of really looking at what did I say and what did students say in response? How were we jointly constructing meaning? I wanted to give us a minute to think about this process, the larger context of thinking about each moment of teaching and learning as ethical and political, and the process of supporting new teachers in thinking about the ethical and political context of each moment of teaching. So just want to hear a couple of voices. What resonates, or what sort of wonderings do you have? Or what are other interpretations you might have about what's happening here? So if anyone is willing to share, I'd love to hear 1 or 2 comments. We can come back to this again at the end, but I want to give some space for what's coming up in the moment.
Hi, my name is Taylor.
Yeah.
This is going to be my first year as a teacher educator, so I've never actually done it before, so I'm really appreciative. I really liked your prompt about prompting students to consider how the moment would be viewed from others, especially by their students. I just thought that's such a good prompt and like a moment of reflection when you're talking with a new teacher. It's really easy when you're teaching, especially when you're new, to be so focused on what you're doing and so concerned with like what you're saying and what's on your board that sometimes you can forget to think, okay, how are other people going to view what I'm saying? Or how are the students going to interpret what I'm doing? So I just loved that prompt.
Thanks, Taylor. And I think what was really powerful in these situations too is again going back to the idea of trying to narrate or really even transcribe as far as possible or reconstruct what a conversation looked like. As you're saying, then opens up this possibility. Okay, if I look at this over again, because I've externally represented it, if I look at this again, what other forms of like what might others have been feeling this in this space? Thank you. Any
I
other thoughts?
I also, oh yeah, I do. I don't know if you can hear me. My name is Jennifer, and I just want to say how much I appreciated what you shared. I've seen this so much, especially we have our students. I support students in social studies, and they come in so passionate and have um, about beliefs and ways of the world, which are so incredibly important. But it's like, how do you navigate through that with the teaching, right? Like, how do you um, ask questions? How do you think about content? How are you responsive to students? How are you helping them to really dig and engage in the content and come to understandings? And I really appreciate you sharing that. It really gets to a lot of what happens when we're working with students.
Thanks, Jennifer, and really resonate with that as well. Again, my background is in STEM, oftentimes in science education, and I think what you are saying is also just reminding ourselves of like the power of thinking about discipline and discipline learning
Mm-hmm.
so intertwined with who we become. Right?
Yes.
Because learning is never about just learning a discipline. It's also who we are becoming as racialized beings, as gendered beings, as people who are classed and have linguistic labels on ourselves. And so really thinking about this interplay between what are we learning in terms of content and what are we learning in terms of who we are becoming as human beings. And again, this attention to each moment that it draws this attention to both of those, right? What's being learned and who are we becoming in the process? Who are we becoming individually, but who are we also becoming collectively? I know we're coming on time, so I'm going to move forward on this. Just wanted to share one more case, and I'm not going to read this in depth, but I want to allow for just another type of example. So another case that I explored is a case of a teacher, again, first year teacher, who was placed in the school context. And she, and Gabriela had a student, Luisa, who on her, say, second or third day shared that she wasn't comfortable speaking in Spanish because of her Salvadorian accent. And so Gabriela, again, accounted for this as perhaps forms of internalized racism, people not being proud of their identities, and um, expressed in her journals how she wanted to focus on helping Luisa become um, just more comfortable with her identity, proud of her identity, proud of speaking in Spanish. But what happens over the course of the quarter, as the students were embedded in this class, in the school, and they were doing walking tours with their students, their K-12 high school students, they started their high school students would tell them, these are where the African American students would hang out. This is where the where Mexican American students hang out. These are where the Salvadorians hang out. And so what we really started to see is one of the key tensions that existed in that space was between Salvadorian American and Mexican American students. And so a lot of the racial analysis that we had, given the literature focuses on Latinos and African Americans, or even using the term Latino, which worked well in our classroom context and theory context. And what was fascinating about this class is we'd have one class at UCLA and then one class at our school. And just the way students spoke about things were dramatically different. Because part of what because in the university context, I think there's a luxury in which we talk about it in a more abstract way. Well, so it'd be like a jarring consideration going Monday at UCLA to Wednesdays when we're at the school site in the family center, and what really came up for students. But what that helped us do is to really understand dynamics of race and power within the local context. So thinking about race and power was not there anymore an abstracted issue that operated at a macro level, but it really began to be, the students began to understand it within the context of this particular school. How do we think about it in embedded histories of this particular school in a particular region of Los Angeles with particular social political dynamics? So from there, it became evident that the issue of this high school student not speaking Spanish was not a question about our own pride in speaking Spanish, but it was really about the racial politics of that school. And it shifted the focus for our entire class and then thinking about how we conceptualize race and ethnicity, but that it gets layered on with patriarchy, but also immigration status and the generation of immigration. Right? And so these complexities became really powerful, but also became this opportunity for theory building and for us to think about not only using theory, but then to generate theory that informed our own practice. So I want us to come back to this question of what it means to attend to each moment as ethical and political, and what it would mean for your work as a supervisor. Given where we're at time, I wanted to end on a final note before coming back to this question, these set of questions, and opening it up for ourselves. But that's really thinking about, again, elevating the centrality of supervision in teacher education. So everything I described could have happened and would have been passing moments that were irrelevant to the learning of students if there wasn't a space for someone else, for a teacher educator, for a partner, for the classroom community to be in conversation with them about the meaning of these micro moments. And I think that's something that's so often overlooked, that there's a whole realm of experiences that teachers have, or novice teachers have, but to what extent are committed, intentional supervisors present to help them draw out the meaning, but then to make connections between those micro interactions, what they're learning in coursework, and what they're experiencing in other places in a teacher ed program. I also want to emphasize this in terms of how do we elevate the centrality of supervision in teacher education. In this context of teacher education, getting constrained to coursework and placements without intentional supervision. We see this more and more with the political pressure and economic pressure. Teacher ed programs are being, again, constrained. But the assumption is that if you take a set of coursework and if you spend time in classrooms, that you've somehow become prepared to be a teacher. What's missing here is the centrality of a supervisor, of a more knowledgeable other, at least in some context, to be your coach, to be in conversation with you, to bring meaning to these interactions that otherwise seem passing, seem irrelevant. And again, what I'm really excited about this group and the work that Lisa and others on the core team have done is to be able to elevate the role of of supervision. But again, how do we move this in a way that then has a more profound effect on the institutional contexts of teacher education programs? And part of that in our program in teacher education at Berkeley has been a profound redesign from the ground up of our teacher education program. And part of that has been putting supervision, or again, borrowing from the ways in which much of it was done at UCLA, thinking about faculty advisors, people who really support supervision, but also making the connections to practicum and coursework, putting that at the center of a program. It is possible, but I do also want to recognize that it's fraught, right? Because power is invested within this. It also includes many other interests, right? In terms of what people teach, how they teach it, what resources a university commits to supervision, to teacher education. So part of what I hope this group will move forward in is thinking about the centrality of supervision, thinking about the role that it plays, but then also how do we reimagine and redesign teacher education programs that allow for that as well. So with that, I'll come back to this guiding question. Would love to hear from any of you. I think we have a few minutes, 2 to 3 minutes left, perhaps. Any thoughts, questions, comments?
I was just going to highlight a couple of comments in the chat, Thomas. So I know my colleague Johnny mentioned just appreciating the need for us as supervisors to step back and also learn to listen to our beginning teachers' perspectives, check our own biases about what teaching should or could be as we listen to them. But if others want to add, I know there's some other comments here.
Something that resonated with me was the luxury of abstract conversations. And I feel as a supervisor, I have that luxury because I have that luxury with my teacher candidate because it's another adult. And sometimes there are adults that I know, sometimes not, or that I'm getting to know. So there's that luxury, and I have to count on their narration of their interaction with students or students' interactions with each other, because I'm only seeing a very limited slice of the day or of their week or of their quarter.
Thank you for sharing, Margaret. I don't know if there are other comments or questions, but I just want to say thank you so much, Thomas. I know we only have a couple of minutes, but I know for me, that really spoke to what we've been talking about as a group in STENT and in our community. How do we re-envision teacher education to really kind of harness those opportunities that supervisors have to be in those really important connecting places with their student teachers. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's been powerful and really given us a lot to think about. So, and I know there are a lot of comments in chat. Hopefully you can see all of those, but and I know there are resource folders for each workshop. So the article that you referenced, Thomas, is in the resource folder for the keynote this morning. So if you want to read that article, and are you open to follow-up questions if people want to contact you?
Absolutely. I mean, always good to be in conversation with everyone. And again, thank you all for having me here, and thank you, Lisa, for creating the space. I wish you all the best in this next few days. And again, trying to just an invitation again to think about how do we think about each moment as ethical and political, and how do we elevate the importance of supervision in programs of teacher education.
Thank you.